This is Mr. Kennedy, and today we're discussing something that is happening quietly, systematically, and in numbers large enough to be culturally significant. We are talking about the exact moment capable men walk away from the dating market permanently. I call it the final exit. This is not rage quitting. This is not incel withdrawal. This is not the bitter retreat of men who tried and failed. We are talking about something entirely different and considerably more profound. We are talking about high-value men, men with resources, with accomplishments, with options, who are making a calm, deliberate choice to build lives of total autonomy. Lives without the complexity, the performance requirements, and the endless negotiation of modern relationships. Lives that don't include anyone, not because nobody was available, but because being alone became preferable to what being partnered now requires. If you are here expecting me to diagnose this as a crisis of masculinity, or if you want me to tell you that these men are secretly lonely and broken, you are in the wrong place. We don't deal in socially acceptable lies on this channel. We deal in reality. And the reality is that when the men who built things, who contributed enormously, and who would have been the stable centers of families, decide to quietly exit the entire project of coupling, they are not registering a personal failure. They are registering a systemic failure. A failure so profound that the people who had the most to offer decided the game wasn't worth playing anymore. Stay with me. This goes deeper than you think. Let's define our terms clearly, because this phenomenon gets confused with other things constantly, and the confusion is not accidental. The culture has a vested interest in misidentifying what this is. Call it a loneliness epidemic, and you make it a mental health problem. Call it incel behavior, and you make it a social pathology. Call it a failure to launch, and you make it an individual defect. Every one of those framings serves the same purpose: to prevent men from recognizing that what they're witnessing in other men, and perhaps feeling themselves, is not a malfunction. It is a rational response to a broken incentive structure. The final exit is not men hiding from life. It is not depression or isolation. These are men who are professionally successful, financially stable, and often living exactly where they want to live, doing exactly what they want to do. They are not diminished. They are optimized. They have taken the energy, resources, and time that the performance of modern partnership would have consumed, and they have redirected those inputs toward building a life that actually returns what it costs. The final exit is the considered decision by men who have built themselves well to prioritize the life they can build alone over the life they might access through a relationship. And they do this not from bitterness, but from genuine preference based on an honest cost-benefit analysis. They looked at what modern relationships require: the performance, the negotiation, the emotional labor, the resource allocation, the legal risks, the constant need to manage someone else's dissatisfaction. And they looked at what they could build alone, and they chose alone, deliberately, permanently. Let's be precise about who is making this choice, because the profile matters enormously. Understanding who is making this decision changes what the decision means. These are not broke men. They are high earners, financially independent, with savings, investments, and no debt burden. They have the resources to live exactly as they choose, and that financial independence is not incidental to the choice. It is foundational. A man who needs a second income to maintain his lifestyle has a practical reason to partner that overrides his preferences. A man who has built financial self-sufficiency has removed that pressure entirely. His decision to be alone is a pure expression of preference, uncontaminated by necessity. These are not socially incompetent men. Many of them had successful relationships earlier in their lives. They were married. They were in long-term partnerships. They learned intimacy well enough to understand exactly what it costs and exactly what it returns. The final exit is not being made by men who never had access to partnership. It is being made by men who had it, understood it from the inside, ran the full accounting, and decided the ledger didn't balance. The final exit happens most often in a man's 40s, 50s, and 60s, after they've seen it, after they've done it, after they have the full data set about what partnership looks like over years and decades, not the early months of chemistry and novelty, but the long middle stretch where the real costs become visible. The choice is being made from experience, not from ignorance. These men are not naive about what they're walking away from. They know exactly what they're walking away from. That's precisely why they're walking. Furthermore, these are competent, self-sufficient men. They know how to cook, clean, manage a household, handle finances, maintain their health, and build a social life. The old framework where a man needed a wife to manage his domestic life simply doesn't apply to this generation. When domestic labor is no longer a reason to partner, one of the traditional trade-offs disappears completely. The equation has fewer terms on the benefit side and the same terms on the cost side. The math gets worse. So, what are they exiting from? To understand why this choice is being made, you have to understand precisely what is being rejected. And let me be direct about this. It's not women in the abstract. It's the specific, unavoidable reality of what modern relationships require in practice. The distinction matters. This is not about hostility toward women as people. This is about a cold assessment of what the modern relationship contract demands and what it returns. They are exiting the performance. Modern relationships involve constant performance, and the performance requirements have escalated substantially in recent decades. You are expected to perform emotional availability that feels genuine, regardless of how you actually feel on a given day. You must perform the role of the modern partner, which carries expectations that shift constantly and must be met regardless of whether they were ever clearly communicated. You must be the traditional provider and the modern egalitarian simultaneously, the man who handles the finances and the man who considers every financial decision a joint consultation. You must be the stoic rock when stability is needed and the emotionally vulnerable communicator when openness is demanded. You must be sexually confident but emotionally sensitive, ambitious but present, independent but entirely available. The exhaustion of maintaining that performance year after year is something men experience in enormous numbers but rarely name out loud, because naming it invites the diagnosis of emotional immaturity. The men making the final exit have named it clearly. They decided the exhaustion simply isn't worth what the performance purchases. They are exiting the negotiation. Every aspect of shared life is a negotiation, and the cumulative weight of that negotiation is something men rarely calculate in advance but feel completely in practice. How money gets spent, how time gets allocated, what the home looks like, where you live. A decision that was once an individual expression of preference becomes a negotiated compromise that neither person fully chose. What you eat for dinner, who you spend time with socially, what temperature the thermostat is set to. These are small things individually. Aggregated across years, across thousands of interactions, they constitute a constant friction that grinds against a man's sense of autonomy in ways that are cumulative and exhausting. Autonomy means the end of negotiation. You simply do what you decide to do. The relief men describe when they reach genuine autonomy after years of partnership is not the relief of loneliness being preferable to connection. It is the relief of a man who has been carrying a weight he didn't fully acknowledge until he set it down. They are exiting the emotional labor and the dissatisfaction management. This is the cost that is perhaps least discussed and most significant. The particular burden of being structurally responsible for someone else's happiness in a culture that simultaneously tells women they should never settle, that they deserve everything they want, that their feelings are always valid, and that if they are not completely satisfied in a relationship, it is evidence that something is wrong, usually with the man. The men making the final exit have spent enough years attempting to manage the unmanageable to recognize the pattern clearly. They tried harder, they communicated better, they provided more, they attended to the emotional landscape of the relationship with genuine effort, and they discovered what the pattern always produces, a standard that shifts in response to being met. The goalpost is not fixed. It cannot be fixed. The satisfaction they are being asked to maintain is structurally impossible to deliver because the architecture of the expectation prevents permanent fulfillment. Meet the standard, and the standard advances. Fall short, and it is evidence of inadequacy. There is no winning move inside that structure. The only winning move is to exit the game. They are exiting the risk. This is where the analysis becomes most concrete and least deniable. The legal risk of marriage and long-term cohabitation, the financial risk of an asset division system that treats two people's contributions as equivalent, regardless of who generated what, the risk that years of investment, financial, emotional, temporal, can be unilaterally terminated at any point, with consequences that frequently devastate the man financially and structurally, while leaving the woman with the home, the children, the social support network, and a monthly payment from the man she decided to leave. These men aren't making uninformed decisions. They have data. They know that between 70 and 80% of divorces are initiated by women. They know the family court system was designed in an era when women had fewer economic options and the protections made different sense, and that the system has not updated to reflect the reality that those economic conditions no longer exist. They've watched their fathers go through it, their friends, their colleagues, men who did everything right, who were faithful and hardworking and present, who got destroyed anyway because their partner decided she was no longer happy. They understand viscerally that the contract is structurally asymmetric. Opting out of the contract entirely is the only logical move that eliminates the risk completely. This brings us to a cultural shift that mainstream society finds deeply disorienting and cannot explain without pathologizing the men involved. For most of human history, being partnered was the ultimate status marker for a man. The successful man was the married man, the man with the family, the home, the visible evidence of his ability to attract and maintain a partner over time. Singleness was associated with failure, with incompleteness, with a man who hadn't yet achieved what a real man achieves. That association was so deep and so consistent across cultures that it operated as an almost universal social fact. For the men making the final exit, that calculus has inverted completely. Being alone is no longer the consolation prize for men who couldn't succeed in relationships. Being alone is the reward for men who succeeded well enough to no longer need to perform for anyone's approval. What does genuine autonomy actually feel like from the inside? Let's be specific, because this is where the abstract becomes concrete, and where men who are still inside the system begin to understand what they're calculating. You wake up and the entire day is yours. Every decision you make is based on your own preferences, your own priorities, and your own sense of what matters on that particular day. You don't manage anyone else's mood before you've managed your own morning. You don't perform emotional availability before you've had time to locate your own emotional state. The shape of your day, your week, your year, your life, it is entirely your construction. No negotiation required, no performance necessary, no dissatisfaction to manage. The cognitive space that was occupied by the constant attentiveness that partnership requires becomes available for other things, for work that matters, for pursuits that are genuinely meaningful, for the simple, underrated experience of silence in your own home. For a man who has spent decades managing the complexity of partnership, the constant attentiveness to someone else's emotional state, the allocation of his hard-earned resources according to a negotiated agreement that never fully reflected his preferences, the performance of a version of himself calibrated to what the relationship required rather than who he actually is, total autonomy feels like freedom on a level that is difficult to overstate until you've experienced it. The status isn't the autonomy itself. The status is having nothing left to prove. The man who makes the final exit has typically achieved whatever he set out to achieve professionally. He has the resources he needs. He has built the life he wanted to build, and he has no remaining reason to continue performing masculinity for anyone's approval. The hunger for external validation that drives so much male behavior, the bigger house, the better car, the impressive title, the visible relationship, has been resolved. Not suppressed, resolved. He's past it. Being alone becomes the ultimate status signal because it communicates something most men never get to communicate authentically. I don't need your approval. I don't need a partner to validate my worth. I have everything I need, and I am entirely self-sufficient. Not as a defensive posture, as a genuine statement of fact. That is a form of power that genuinely terrifies the social system, because a man who cannot be shamed about being single, who doesn't need female validation to feel complete, who refuses to trade his peace for a contract stacked against him, that man has no available lever. He cannot be motivated by the promise of access. He cannot be controlled by the threat of social judgment. He has exited every mechanism the system uses to manage male behavior. The culture will tell you these men are bitter. It will call it a loneliness epidemic. It will frame them as emotionally stunted, as men who are afraid of intimacy, as men who never grew up. These narratives are not accidental. They serve a specific function: to generate enough shame and social pressure to pull men back into a game they've correctly identified as rigged against them. It isn't working, because the men who've made the final exit calculation aren't operating on social shame as a motivator. They've completed the transition past the point where external social judgment has traction. They're operating on analysis, on lived experience, on a full accounting of costs and returns that no amount of narrative pressure can alter. When you actually speak to these men, you don't find bitterness. You find something the mainstream narrative is entirely unprepared for. You find peace. You find men who have relocated to smaller towns or quieter neighborhoods, who have simplified their lives down to what actually matters to them, who are engaged in pursuits that are genuinely meaningful rather than impressive. Woodworking, restoration projects, fishing, hiking, building things, reading seriously, cooking well, maintaining their health with real attention. Pursuits that require no audience, that generate no status signal, that simply deliver what they promise, day after day, without the performance requirement. requirements. Here is what this phenomenon is actually registering. When a significant percentage of your most capable, stable, accomplished men calculate that the modern relationship game isn't worth playing at the terms currently offered, the correct response is not to pathologize the men. The correct response is to examine the terms. Men respond to incentives. That is not a controversial statement. When the modern relationship contract demands traditional male obligations, provider, protector, financial foundation, emotional stability, while progressively stripping away the traditional respect, authority, and reciprocity that made those obligations a rational trade, rational men decline the contract. The surprise isn't that this is happening at the scale it's happening. The surprise is that it took this long for the numbers to become impossible to ignore. This channel exists because I got tired of watching capable men sacrifice their peace, their financial security, their time, and their dignity for a system that blames them for everything and protects them from nothing. I got tired of the narrative that men who opt out are failing, when the data consistently shows that they are frequently the men with the most to offer, making the most precise, logical, and self-respecting decision of their lives. If you are a man who has already made the final exit, if you are living the autonomous life and experiencing exactly what I've described, understand that you are not alone and you are not broken. You are simply seeing the board clearly. If you are a man who is doing the math right now, who is feeling the cost of the modern relationship market and starting to question whether the return justifies the investment, stay with the analysis. Don't let the social pressure to perform partnership override the calculation your own experience is showing you. The data you're sitting on is more reliable than the narrative being pushed at you from every direction. You are choosing your peace over their performance. You are choosing your autonomy over their approval. You are building a life that costs less than it returns, in a world that will tell you that choice makes you less of a man. It doesn't. It makes you the only kind of man who actually wins the game. The man who was smart enough to stop playing it. Drop a comment below. Share your experience. When did you realize the math didn't add up? Have you made your exit, or are you still running the numbers? The conversation matters. Men sharing their honest data points with other men is exactly how this information reaches the people who need it most. Subscribe to the channel. We will continue to dissect the realities of the modern market without the romantic illusions, without the sugarcoating, and without the politically acceptable lies that keep capable men trapped in contracts designed to extract from them. The final exit is not the end of something. It is the beginning of the only life that was ever actually yours. Stay healthy.